Hi, I'm Karen Brooks, Executive Director of Early Music America, and I'm afraid the technical glitch was due to my losing my Wi-Fi 2 minutes before the hour. So I am now tethered to my iPhone, which amazingly enough is working. It's amazing what we all have to do right now. Very, very happy to introduce you to Gus Denhard and Monica Rojas-Steart, who is speaking to you today from Seattle. Early Music Seattle has been engaging in community partnerships with the intention of advancing justice in the arts since 2015. And Gus is the executive director of Early Music Seattle. He's been there for about 2 decades now, and this work has become increasingly important in the work they do within the arts community in Seattle. He's also a performer of the lute family of instruments. He has a doctorate in musicology from Indiana University's Historical Performance Institute. Dr. Monica Rojas-Steart is a cultural anthropologist, community leader, activist, and performing artist. Is originally from Peru. She's assistant director of the African Studies and Latin American Caribbean Studies programs at the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies. She's also, and this is what's particularly pertinent to today, she is the founder and board advisor of Movimiento Afro-Latino Seattle, an organization formed to ensure the sustainability of ongoing cultural and educational arts activities focused on Afro-Latinos. And Monica and Gus have worked together on a number of projects, and there's a very large project that they did with the Seattle Symphony that they're going to discuss a little later in the discussion. But I think the work that they have done has shown, although difficult and taking a long time, has shown that over that time, working together and understanding how to work together yields really wonderful results. And that this is just the start of their journey. I'm sure they think there is way more to do. And I think we're all extremely interested in learning about how they got to this point and the challenges that they faced and the missteps that they have made along the way and how they've dealt with those and moved on. I know that they are going to ask you, so just be ready for this to start thinking about presenting your own projects in the chat area. And we will be able to examine those in the last third of this session. Meanwhile, I'm going to hand it over to Monica and Gus for the next little while. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Probably good afternoon for some of you. Thank you to Early Music America for inviting me, for inviting us for this important, very necessary conversation. So thank you, Karen, and thank you, David, for the tech support as well. Gus Denhard and myself, we live, perform, and work in Seattle. So we want to acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We also acknowledge our African and African descent ancestors who were forced to cross many waters and lands. We stand on their shoulders. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And I would like to start by explaining what is going to happen here today. Gus and I will use the first 40 minutes or so to explain the purpose of the session, list some of the projects and efforts that Early Music Seattle launched under the leadership of Gus, some key points of what worked, what didn't work, and why. We will then pause to take some of your questions for about 5 minutes or so, and then after that, Gus and I will spend some time unpacking our experience around Jordi Savall's Routes of Slavery and how we responded to that. And then at the end, we will leave about 30 minutes or so for your ideas and questions. But we do want to hear from you. So if you could please at this moment, maybe in the chat room, you could tell us, share with us what, if you plan to have if you have a project that you would like to share with us, what it is. And we would like to hear from you at this moment. So, we would like to know how many people would like to share projects and get feedback. And so please use the chat to do that, and I will turn it over to Gus.
Thanks, Monica. The purpose of this workshop is to learn to build strong, authentic connections to musicians, organizations, and audiences outside of the established white communities we currently serve with early music. To accomplish this, we'll deconstruct some of our past work and propose methods that white organizations can use to build lasting partnerships with communities of color, artists, and organizations. Early music is often seen as an art form practiced by white musicians or white audiences. Of what early music makes disconnect from communities of color is the centering of Europe in all of our programming approaches. It's not so much the quantity of your music we cover, it's more the central role that we consistently assign to Europe. With little recognition of other forces that were at work during our medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods. When we do take on subjects like the Middle East, China, and Africa, we often approach them as afterthoughts or as something special outside of our normal operations. And we don't look for help that we need to get the context right. And by centering Europe in our premise, we centered ourselves, whites, in the process of making the art.
Gus, can I introduce?
Personally, I didn't get
Gus,
much.
sorry.
Yes.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? Your audio was very garbled there for about 2 minutes. And I'm really sorry. Do you mind just backing up just a little? Just literally about a minute or two. I'm really sorry about that.
Yes, I can. And please signal me again. Okay at the moment?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we do take on subjects like Latin America, the Middle East, China, and Africa, we often approach them as afterthoughts, something special. We don't look for the help we need to get the context right. And by centering Europe in our premise, we've centered ourselves, white people, in the process of making the art. I didn't get much non-Eurocentric history in school, but much later came to understand some of the cultural intersections that formed Europe. There are some writers that see this in a broad context, and among others, they can help provide inspiration for broader programming. They're not academic texts, just mostly inspirational, and you'll see them in the chat. The Silk Roads by Peter Frankopan, and 2 books by Charles Mann, 1491 and 1493. You can kind of imagine the subject matter there. If we can get this right, if we can learn to partner, there are some real benefits. Finally, music can be placed in a true historical and cultural context. There can be more diversity on stage and in the concert hall. There can be public recognition that early music does not need to be a whites-only art form, and that everyone's welcome in telling the stories of history through music. But there are barriers, pitfalls, mostly created by the institutional racism that structures our organizations and every organization in the US. I'm going to recount a few projects designed to meet these goals that EMS has undertaken since 2014. There was growth in understanding of how relationships with people of color can become authentic, but there were many missteps and still much learning to do. How's my sound? Okay, thanks. In 2014, we presented Pasión en el siglo XVII, Passion in the 17th Century, with the Mexican Consulate General as a partner. And for this project, students of the tenor Eric Menzel from Ars Vocalis Mexico, which is a festival in Mexico, came to Seattle to prepare and perform concerts in celebration of Mexican Independence Day. We did concerts in Seattle and also in Yakima, a region with a large Latino population. These events served local Latino people almost exclusively and were well received, including school performances, official celebrations, a house party, fundraiser, and they gave a lot of professional experience to aspiring early music performers, one of whom has gone on to have a career in early music. But looking back, this project would have been more effective if we had included other local Latino cultural organizations in our work. And by partnering with just the Mexican consulate, an arm of the Mexican government, we were not universally trusted by Latino communities. Just the fact of this monolithic partnership excluded many local artists from participating. We didn't even know we missed this opportunity. Also in 2014, we did a concert for Ebola relief with a Liberian community just south of Seattle. Early Music Seattle sponsored a concert of medieval music written in the time of our plague to support activities of a Liberian church fighting Ebola in their home country. Attendance was poor. Our white audience mostly stayed away. Perhaps they didn't see this as the place for an early music organization to be active outside of our normal role of providing art for art's sake. But in retrospect, the white savior dynamic was probably at work here. We were not so much partnering as saving. We had no close contacts in African diaspora communities in those days and went through no extended process to try to meet people, get to know them, and find out what would be truly helpful. In 2015, we brought Ensemble Tembembe to Seattle and Central Washington, along with the Mexican consulate. The consulate proposed this idea, and Early Music Seattle responded by providing financial and logistical support for performances in celebration of Mexican Independence Day. Tembembe had performed on Early Music Seattle's international series the previous year with Savall, Hesperian 21. So we assumed guaranteed success and a huge audience of putting together our international series audience and the audience brought by the consulate. But there was a bit of a contrast. When we presented Tembembe on stage with Savall the previous year, all the familiar white people came, but almost no Latino people. And when we presented Tembembe without Savall, advertised in July with the Mexican consulate, a very large Latino audience came.
Gus, you're going again.
I'm wondering if I should try another microphone. I'm so sorry. Can you still hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes. We have a great view of your shirt.
Well, let me continue to try. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. When we presented Tembembe under the auspices of the Mexican consulate, combined with Early Music Seattle, advertised in 2 languages, we got a large Latino audience, but almost no white people. So then the white people who came seemed to be uncomfortable when they found themselves surrounded by Spanish speakers. And truly, the repertoire was almost identical to the 2 concerts. But the marketing, organizational affiliations, and probably more signaled to the audience, telling them who was supposed to attend. One positive outcome, in addition to the consulate, we built new relationships with an arts organization that was trusted in the Latino community called La Sala, and that new friendship would open doors in years to come. In 2016, we presented Dia de los Muertos and Dia del Músico with Grupo Cultural Huaqueño, Banda Gazona, the Mexican Consulate, La Sala, Tacoma Art Museum, and the Jack Straw Cultural Center. We had gathered a consortium of organizations and funders to support multiple events around the state, funded by the state of Washington. Mostly Latino people attended, but there was more crossover this time to white audiences, and it was seen as a successful event. But looking back, we made a misstep. We branded the activities without the direct involvement of the Oaxacan people, and we decided to call it a Oaxacan Art and Music Festival. We overstepped by doing this, and we could have been accused of commodifying Oaxacan sacred community traditions.
We framed their story in our way without their explicit permission. Looking back, I see how easy it is for us to impose our values on others. We tend to think of white culture as universal and inherently logical. This tendency needs to be questioned constantly, and the best way to avoid it is to let the partner organizations lead and stay in close communication with them. In 2020, we presented The Other Conquest with Orchestra Northwest, Ensemble Caprice, and a Mexican music director, composer, and librettist. This partnership was formed to create an alternate narrative to the conquest of Mexico. Vivaldi's 18th century opera Montezuma was presented on the first half by Caprice, followed by a commissioned work by a Mexican composer, Hector Armienta, called The Ballad of Mexico, from the Mexican point of view. We were partners in creating a performance where strong historical perspectives, European and indigenous, clashed strongly, but to beautiful effect. We provided grant resources, administrative support, and had a joint artistic role with Orchestra Northwest. We supplied Vivaldi's Montezuma and the financial support for the Mexican cantata. This time, EMS conscientiously refrained from offering artistic input or any other aspect to Orchestra Northwest's portion of the performance. I say consciously because we have a tendency to lead, offer suggestions, etc. This is a problem because there's a power imbalance between organizations of the size of Orchestra Northwest and Early Music Seattle, where a suggestion could have been interpreted as a requirement to maintain the relationship. We did much better this time, mostly by staying out of aspects of the performance that were not ours, letting the artists tell their story from the Mexican side with the resources we provided. And although Orchestra Northwest, through them, we made other new contacts, partnerships for another project coming up soon. So this felt like our most successful one to date, that included both white and Latino attendees. And I'm going to pass it to Monica. We've left out Roots of Slavery at this point, but Monica now has some comments to make about what was going on in these years of EMS programming. She has some insights into it.
Thank you, Gus. Everybody hears me okay? Yes, okay. So so some of the situations Gus just described and the guesses and conclusions he arrived over the years are the result of a very long process related to a long history of colonialism. And colonialism is pretty much the domination of one group of people over others. And this has been done outside appropriation, right? Appropriation of land, appropriation of resources, and also appropriation of people, or appropriation of bodies for labor. So one population subjugated other populations, and those subjugated people are forced under the threat of death and torture to first erase and forget everything that was theirs. You know, their language, their spirituality, their music, dance, traditions, their way of being. And a lot of time, many families were separated. And on the other hand, now they are forced to adopt a completely foreign way of being and behave. They have to adopt a new language. They have to adopt a new religion, new clothing, new ways of doing things. So once these populations are in this new reality, in the case of African descent people are in a completely new environment, new air, new land. Right now in this new situation under colonialism, those subjected people have to draw from whatever little power they had to reinvent themselves. Their instruments were banned, skin drums were burned, and some of these individuals were forced to learn European instruments, but the vast majority were stripped from everything they had. And that's how people had to use whatever they had at hand to make music. So we have nothing. What do? We have our voice, we have our plantation tools, we have our feet, we have our hands. So that's how spirituals, Negro spirituals are born, and that's how tap dance is born, right? Tap dance was born out of this extreme situation, And that's why there are steel pans in Trinidad and Tobago, and that's why in Peru we hit on a wooden box, and that's why in Mexico people drum by stomping on a wooden platform. So for hundreds of years people had to recreate themselves under these circumstances. And the music that was created out of these communities is music of resilience, music of resistance, music that represents cultural survival. And then you can have independence, and you can have abolition of slavery and treaties and laws, but structures set in place by then are deeply rooted in the system, and ways of being and doing are established. Discrimination continues and racism is alive because some of these things haven't changed. The colonial mind continues to see itself as superior and continues to take and consume whatever it wants, right? So on top of all of that I just described, there is also cultural appropriation over those ways in which people of color needed to reinvent themselves. So for example, I just mentioned tap dance. So as I was putting this together, I Googled greatest tap dancer, and who do I get? I get Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire, right? People create jazz, and then you have Glenn Miller. And out of blues, people create rock and roll, and then who represents rock and roll is Elvis Presley, Beach Boys, right? And then they reinvent themselves and they create rap, and then Eminem takes over, and go on and so forth, right? So these are all clear reasons why people of color don't participate or have a hard time finding a common ground for collaboration. People of color don't want to participate in classical music because of this history of oppression and what these white spaces have historically meant to them. But even, let's say a person of color wants to participate, being able to have access to education, access to music lessons, because of so many other needs that are a priority, music lessons can be a luxury for some people. But even so, if there's scholarships and let's say people get to study, people of color historically have always have to do things, work harder and work 2, 3 or more times harder to prove themselves capable of this. And still, even then, are not guaranteed entrance in this scene or entrance or as a leading role. So people of color don't want so then people of color also don't want to see white people representing or reinterpreting their culture, their traditions. People of color feel uncomfortable in white spaces because of persistent racism and discrimination. So much healing needs to still happen there. And people of color also practice their traditions for many reasons, many other reasons than for the sake of art itself, right? They practice their traditions in a very different context as well. It's their way to historically survive and process pain, to stay connected to our roots, our ancestry. It's our way to grieve, to survive and continue to find strength in an oppressive environment of hundreds of years of oppression. So when you hear demands for equity or phrases like Black Lives Matter, this is speaking directly about this history and about all the catching up that needs to happen. And this won't happen just like that. People of color have to demand and push in order to make room to catch up. So this is in very briefly a history of what are the dynamics that are at play here.
And
so,
this was where we were going to pause for questions. If anybody has anything that they'd like to respond to from what they've heard so far.
Please go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat area, and then I will relay them to Gus and Monica. Right now, we have quite a few comments from people who are, they with projects that they like to discuss, but I don't see any other questions right now. But anybody got anything? Please, if you have any questions at any point, just put them in the chat box and I'll monitor it and make sure that we do get to those at any point. So go ahead, Gus.
So we can continue. And it was at this point that we thought we would unpack our experience of routes of slavery. You may have heard of this production put together by Jordi Savall. I think maybe it is 3 years old now. And Early Music Seattle had an opportunity to be on the second tour to the US of this. And we made the decision to bring it, partnering with the Seattle Symphony. Both our organizations thought it was a stunning show and could be a unifying experience for Seattle. We also hope to build audiences in African diaspora and Latino communities. And by joining force, we thought we could mitigate some of the high costs of this production and combine our audiences. And I should mention, we went ahead to do this before I even knew Monica. We went ahead without any advice or consent from African diaspora communities in Seattle. So then, luckily, I was introduced to Monica by a friend in La Sala, a former partner from a previous project. This is significant because I would not have had this introduction had we not have had this history of working together formerly. So I feel lucky that I was given the chance to bring in a partner. And I was thinking to myself at the time that having a partner in the Afro-Latino community would let us go deeper with the story and hopefully attract a new audience. So I asked Monica to read the script to the show, and I think she has a few comments about that.
Yeah, well, I would like to share my response. Gus and I read it, and he gave me the script, and Gus didn't offer much at the moment. He just gave me the script and said, I would love it if you could read this and give me some thoughts, some feedback. But to be honest, and I shared this with Gus later, when as soon as I read just the title was already problematic to me, because and I set it aside and I didn't even bother to read beyond the first page, because I could kind of sense what was coming. And the first issue for me was that this persistent framing of African descent people's history within the narrative of slavery, as if they didn't exist before and they didn't exist after. And then the quotes that were included in the script were the colonial voice, the white European colonial voice. And there's a lot of victimization of slaves and romanticization of slavery. And of course, the show, the narrative is about those people who are enslaved in very dramatic situations of this condition, but the voices of those that the concert was speaking about are not included. They are excluded. So no voice of African descendants included in the narrative. So I put it aside. I did not bother continue taking notes and giving feedback, because also from my experience, it's always been really hard to find people who are willing to listen, right, to this feedback. So, but then Gus reached out again a week later and said, "Hey, I'm still waiting for your comments." So then I gave it another read and took some notes, and we met, and I was very excited to see Gus' enthusiasm and really truly like wanting to hear my feedback. So then I was honest with Gus, and I shared my feedback, what I just explained, but in more detail. And the first thing that came out of Gus's mouth was, "I need you to repeat everything you just said to me to the Seattle Symphony Orchestra team." So Gus, you can pick up from here.
Yes, it was a little bit of a scary moment to walk in, and having already committed to this show, to be coming to them essentially with an expert that was identifying problems with the performance. And we realized that neither organization wanted to present something that would, there were probably two things at work. We didn't want to present something that was untrue and not authentic to people's experiences. But of course, also, we feared for the reaction from our donors and our constituents, and that maybe this story would offend people. So not maybe a great reason to make an artistic decision, but a practical reason. And so we were in there with there was fear, I guess you could say. And Monica, do I turn it back over to you here?
Well, yeah, please very, very briefly, some of the things I suggested, like, so the Seattle Symphony Orchestra team asked me if there was any part that was specifically problematic that they could cut, but the issue is that the problems were all over the script, including the conception of the project itself. Even some songs that I'm familiar with were not contextualized appropriately. I suggested maybe to start the narrative with just a paragraph before to recount what was there in Africa before the rupture of history through slavery. I suggested maybe a dialogue format where there's, instead of one narrator, two narrators, to have one narrator respond to the narrative. I also said maybe we can weave some artistic traditions done by some local artists here and there during the show, but all of these suggestions, there was a concern about the length of the show. So once when we were discussing this, we were maybe thinking maybe we should have a second part, a different show, another show that would center the voices of those who were not speaking about their own history as a second part to Savall's show. And I had produced a show, a theater production that did exactly that. So, but that also didn't work. We were thinking maybe have people buy tickets for both shows together, promote them together as part A, part B. Then we thought maybe that's too much. Maybe we just have a community dialogue on the lobby of the Naroya Hall right before Routes of Slavery. So there were all these different suggestions and brainstorming, and I even submitted a list of resources that could be included or woven into the narrative, but unfortunately nothing was implemented.
Can I just ask, was that a function of Jordi Savall's pushback, or was it the Seattle Symphony, or was it a combination of both? I mean, was it a practical decision? I mean, there are so many things at play here. It would be interesting to sort of unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think just to make a few comments, of course, not every music director is open to suggestions from the floor about their artistic work. And so it wasn't a particular surprise to not hear from Jordi Savall about the suggestions that we made. There were logistical problems with doing things at Benaroya Hall. We explored it with the symphony, but we were not able to go forward in that direction. So I guess to put a big summary over why these things weren't addressed is going back to Monica's comments earlier, the overarching logic of white culture and the white way of doing things. Her suggestions were not taken seriously, not taken to heart, in my opinion. And the problem that we had here with this show was probably not understood. So I think that is the overarching reason, and I have to admit my own culpability in not understanding the content of what the fire that we were playing with until later in the performance. Well, Monica, maybe it's time to comment a little bit about roads to reconciliation. Do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. So while this conversation was happening between me and Gus and the Seattle Symphony, and this conversation happening, I received a call from Stephen Newby, who is an African-American music professor at Seattle Pacific University. And just like Gus, I guess my name had been mentioned to him as someone he needed to connect for a project he was planning at the university. He was planning a 3-day conference that was going to include African diasporic music, performance, and panel discussions around the topic of reconciliation. And he wanted to call this conference Routes to Reconciliation. And it was going to happen the week after Routes of Slavery. So I was blown away, and I mentioned to Stephen the conversation I had been having with Gus, and I mentioned to Gus the conversation I had with Stephen. So I connected all parts because I felt like this was an opportunity for something really neat for collaborations. And at the end, this is how Stephen Newby became the narrator of Savall's Routes of Slavery. And so we started planning how to connect all of these events and take advantage of these collaborations. But the Seattle Symphony Orchestra team started expressing concerns and even suggested Stephen to change the name of his conference and potentially also change the date. So they started to try to control Stephen on the name of his concert, his conference, and also the date. And then that's when Stephen started referring to his event at the university as roads instead of routes. So he called it Roads to Reconciliation, and we continued planning that event with the hope that we could kind of that could serve as a response to the issues that were brought up because of routes of slavery. Yeah, so Gus, I don't know if you would like to add more of the response from the Seattle Symphony.
Yeah, sure. I should say that probably neither the symphony nor Early Music Seattle was prepared for this topic. Our two organizations began to disagree when it was clear that Savall wouldn't take a new version of the script. They were pushing toward a cancellation. We took the other position, feeling that the Roads to Reconciliation event could mitigate the Eurocentric side that Savall was presenting. We clashed over whether to seek newspaper coverage, recording, other details of how the show was to be positioned for the public. And our relationship became contentious. Then the Seattle Symphony manages one of the venues we perform in. So we were in a tight situation. But really, to emphasize, there was not a lot of high ground here among the white organizations. We were both unprepared for this performance. Looking back a month from where we are now, you can see the explosive nature of the subject that we were trying to essentially commodify. We've been watching this unfold. We did not have, neither organization had any real knowledge and comfort discussing race. We had few people of color on our teams, no one on the board at that time who could speak to the audience response. And we just weren't equipped for the subject that we were dealing with. The show did go on. And Monica, maybe you can talk a little bit about the African diaspora response to the show.
Well, African diaspora, indigenous communities, because Early Music Seattle at that point they wanted to make the show accessible and invite these communities who traditionally don't have access to concert halls like these. So they provided tickets, and I had a hard time placing those tickets in the community. Many people didn't want to come, but some people came, and of course they were upset. Some of them left in the intermission, and you're wondering why. Why would they want to? Why would they be upset? Why would they leave? It was mentioned earlier that in one of the events that Gus described, how white people were uncomfortable to be surrounded by Spanish speakers at some event that Early Music Seattle put on. People of color suffer discrimination every day, and I described this history earlier, right? White spaces are uncomfortable for people of color. There is a history that has not been healed. White spaces like concert halls are intimidating for people of color, not only because of the audience members present, but because these spaces many times represent an oppressive history, and simply they don't relate to certain spaces the same way because of the way they are set up or are used. People of color do not want to see white people interpreting their own traditions. Some of these traditions are even sacred to them. So you may think, but Savall is Spanish. He may not fall into this category of white, but he is white to us. He represents the colonizer, and even if artists on the show include people of color, still, it is the same dynamics of colonial subjugation by being under the direction of Savall. No, Savall is from Spain. Savall is Spanish. There is a relationship between Mexico, Peru, and other parts of the Americas with Spain that has not been healed. And the aesthetics of the show, I can also expand more on the aesthetics of the show, but it's everything these traditions are not, presented on stage the way they were presented, are very contrasting to the way these traditions are practiced in an organic way. In Benaroya Hall is like a live museum exhibit of culture, curated, clean, and manicured. So there's many reasons why people were resistant to go, but also felt uncomfortable in the space.
Do you know how it was received in the other places that it was presented? Because I know that the Jordi Savall production was performed in at least a couple of other places, including Berkeley, I think.
I certainly heard very good reviews about the performance. I am not sure that, I'm not actually aware of any local partnerships that were brought into play in the bringing of the roots of slavery to the other locations. I can't really speak to it. Yeah.
I did hear.
Sorry, we can't hear you. Try again.
I did hear, I believe in one of the conversations we had with the Seattle Symphony team that there was a lot of resistance in New York, actually. There was some people rioting outside of the concert hall. I don't know if you remember these, Gus, but in New York, there was a bad reaction as well, right?
Yeah.
Was there any, there's a question from one of the members of the audience. Was there eventually a response from Savall or his team? Were you able to ever discuss any of these questions with him directly?
Monica, I think you can answer that, but he did get back and address the points that were made one by one, but wasn't actually willing to concede any changes to the plan that he had.
Yeah, he did respond, but he was very dismissive. Like what the issues I was raising didn't really matter. That's the overall response. That the way I felt the response.
And how, given that he is revered by so many people, and when when you have presented him in the past, Gus, presumably to large, enthusiastic audiences, how did you deal with this sort of disconnect here? Did you feel like how did you communicate with your own audiences and at Early Music Seattle? And, did you feel that you were sort of compromising yourselves in some ways?
Yeah, I did feel blindsided by the result of this particular event. And in the past, it is always, going back to the collaboration with Tembembe and Savall with his Hesperion. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of that program, but it was the Mexican ensemble doing folklore music derived from the Spanish original content, back and forth, beautifully done. But again, when I look at the people who attended this first event, it was pitched toward a European-oriented audience. We were watching a tradition take place in the way that we like to watch everything, which is in the formal concert hall setting. And so I think without Monica's input, if we had just gone forward, probably all of these issues may have passed unnoticed, quite frankly. Because again, our organizations, we perform for ourselves, we perform for our people in the way that they are used to consuming what we offer. So the blessing of this experience was that we got, and even though there were problems, our organization got to experience what they were. And we have a person that we can talk to. We have a number of people we can talk to. Monica and I are still friends, maybe better friends since this has all happened. So if I wanted to back away from the experience is that we need colleagues to be able to tell the big story of ancient music. And the only way to do that is to get in there and get your hands a little bit dirty, have some miscommunications, talk, check in. If people are doing their music, let them lead. Don't assume that that you have a solution for how to present it. Allow time for conversations. Yeah, just some of the basics. And is there a question? Is this a good time for questions?
Well, one question, a couple of questions. One is following on from the Jordi Savall incident is, could you give an example or two of how he was resistant to change, if he did, or did he just simply not want to engage at all?
Monica, do you have a memory of how he addressed your points, sort of one by one?
I document where I list in detail what the issues were and my recommendations, and we run that document by the Seattle Symphony team, and I didn't communicate directly with him. I don't know if it was through you guys or it was through the Seattle Symphony, but I would have to dig in my email, but I remember there was a response, but was he responded, he disagreed with some things that I said. I think I proposed to use the word enslaved instead of slave, and then I said something like people were never enslaved. They were never slaves, they were enslaved, and he came back to me with no, they were slaves, and other things he agreed, but was kind of dismissive. And I guess something that I want to say that I don't want, I want to make sure that I say this, but I do believe in his efforts. Savall, I had the opportunity to hear him talk at one of the events that Early Music Seattle put on months before bringing the show to Seattle. And the things he said, I do believe that he has good intentions by telling this story. And through Gus, I also heard that he had some resistance for putting on this show, this history, to tell the story of slavery. So I believe in his good intentions, but when he was challenged, the responses that I got were very dismissive, unfortunately. Maybe with more time and more conversation, we could have achieved something.
Another question is how did Roads to Reconciliation respond to Savall's piece?
Yeah, well, we can move on to describe a little bit Roads to Reconciliation. So what we wanted to do through Roads was to center the voices of African descent people to tell their own story. And we have a listing of things that work and didn't work. I don't know, Gus, if you have some memory of how we ended up putting that together.
Yeah, the list of things that that worked and didn't work in terms of the things that almost didn't work is we had a change of venue and we were directed to use a church, a large sanctuary with the cross and everything else, and of course I did not. It seemed like an expedient solution to me, and certainly to the other presenters. But Monica, what does the church mean to some people?
Well, I read earlier here in this session the history of oppression, and religion played a big role in this oppression, right? So the church, although it made sense because it has a stage and the audience members can comfortably see it and watch a show, and there's a space to set up a sound system and everything, there is a deeper meaning to a setting like that. So then it became my role to convey convinced them that we needed to move the event. If we wanted community members, especially African descent people, indigenous people, to come to this event, we needed to move the event to an all-purpose room. So something that worked was that it was a very uncomfortable moment trying to explain why. But eventually the people from Seattle Pacific University really worked with me and worked with us in trying to accommodate what we were recommending to do. So fortunately, we were able to move the event to an all-purpose room, and we set up the seating in a circular way because we wanted to encourage participation and conversation and interaction. So one barrier we broke was we were able to bring people of color to a white Christian university, a white space, right? And I also felt that the people who were supporting with the venue were also stretching their minds and stretching and being accommodating to what we were proposing. So there was a stretch there that I think was something positive.
From the white side of it, because dialing back to our concert hall experience, white people are used to going to a show and watching. This was supposed to be a participatory event, and that was announced. But we fell into a familiar habit of observing a cultural event and not offering ourselves up as part of the conversation. And so some of the we had a sort of deconstruction of this event with the artists later. Some of them felt they were participating in a minstrel show, and we were the audience. It was the mixed result of it was that some white families, my own family, were hearing these stories for the very first time. So while we did not feel like we could offer up our stories in that moment, we went home and we had conversations that we'd never had before. So, if looking back at this, and when you experiment, especially outside of the social circle you always work in, you may not get the results you're looking for, but it was a beginning. And Monica and I have been talking about how to do this again. We learned so much.
Yeah, we also had a larger audience than we expected. We had, I don't know how many people were there, like 200 people. So it became really challenging to encourage conversation. And we also tried to pack way too much and cover too many different communities represented. So there wasn't enough room for conversation. So there are some things that we learned from this process too, but I think it had a very positive effect in many ways. In response to, in comparison to routes of slavery.
And I should say one thing about all of these projects that Early Music Seattle undertook, including Roads to Reconciliation. So we have a very forward-looking state arts commission that funds collaborations like this, and that is their goal. And one of if you run an organization or an ensemble, we always have a feeling of scarcity in our organizations, even though by comparison to other arts organizations, we are wealthy organizations with staff sometimes and resources and money in the bank. We always feel under pressure though. So a funding source to encourage this sort of work is golden for a music director that wants to try these sorts of things. The money could not be appropriated for any other use. It could not be used to present our main activities. So to have those funds available year after year, not a lot of money, but something available year after year. If you're considering this, look in your region. It seems like there must be funders to support these endeavors, maybe now more than ever before.
Sorry, one more, another question. following Gus's point that we should let the native specialists in inverted commas do their thing, yes, we certainly should. What about running into the danger of implying, perhaps unintentionally, that therefore white European music is best performed by white Europeans?
I'm not sure I entirely get it. Maybe you, do you think you understand? You could explain the question a little more?
Perhaps Daniel Lee, do you want to unmute yourself? Oh, maybe I need to unmute you. Just a second, I'll do that.
Sure, I'm happy to unmute. And first of all, thank you for this meeting. This has been a great, informative and eye-opening discussion. I guess perhaps maybe, with all due respect, a white person might not recognize this issue, but as Asian American, I have been told, like, as Asian, why are you in classical music? Why are you playing European music? So I guess my question is, while I agree with you fully that when we bring in other kinds of music, we have to let the other specialists do their thing, that also implies the fact that music of European origin should perhaps be played or led by people of European origin. So how do we deal with that?
Yeah, and that's a really tough question, and one that I don't feel particularly qualified to answer. I think if Monica addressed it earlier, she probably she recounted the barriers for why it's difficult to become involved. All of the reasons that made it difficult for these collaborations that we described certainly come into play for who gets to participate in early music. I'm sorry, I'm not exactly qualified to give you the answer that you probably need for that. Personally, I feel like everyone should play the music that they are drawn to play and feel inspired by. We have a wonderful writer, Leslie Kwan, who talks about her first experiences with the harpsichord, and she captures it beautifully. If you are compelled to do something, you should have access to be able to do it. Maybe that's more the point to be addressed.
But also it's important to keep in mind what is the relationship between the white Europeans, which people perceive as the colonizer, taking music, using music from the minorities, like I explained, this music that comes from a history of cultural resilience and cultural survival, right? That dynamic of appropriating that music is different from those minorities or those people of color learning or wanting to learn music of white Europeans. There's a different dynamic there. So that's important also to keep in mind.
Lots of questions and comments coming in now. So I just want to take a moment to decide whether we'd like to bring in some people, if people would like to present some of their own projects to you, or whether we should go on answering these questions. We said we would look at some of these original projects that people are bringing in their own ideas. It might be a good idea to just bring a couple of those and then return to the questions.
Sure.
I'm just scrolling back through the text, the Q&A, because that's where people are putting the answers in. So, for example, here's from Yonit. Are you ready? I see you in my picture. Would you be ready to? Hi. Would you like to present your the Fandango project? Would you like to just say a little bit about that and what you're working on, a collaborative process and working with people from different cultural, national, and artistic backgrounds in Ireland?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I unmuted. Hi, everybody. Hi, Gus. Long time no see. So we premiered a year ago in Galway at the Early Music Festival, a new program called Fandango. And then we premiered it with a new lineup of some of the same musicians and new musicians at the first ever Latin American Cultural and Arts Festival here in Limerick, which we helped to co-produce, me and Vlad, who's also here. This is still in the making. This was our first two performances. Originally, I just wanted to do an early music program. I didn't know what exactly, and I originally thought Spain. Let's just start with Spain. And then I was introduced to a Mexican dancer who's here, and she does Mexican traditional dance, and she is doing Irish traditional dance, and she is also doing flamenco. Didn't know anything about early music, and never studied ballet really, never did early music dance, but she was very interested, and she also does contemporary dance. So it started out in a conversation, would you be interested? There's this great piece called Fandango. It's a harpsichord solo. Do you want to try dancing to it? And we just went from there. So it was a collaborative process of talking about what we could do together. She is not, what's the sensitive word? She doesn't read Western music notation. So it was this evolving process of what could we do together and how can we work together when we don't speak the same artistic languages. And so it became this multicultural, multilinguistic collaboration. We had a modern guitarist working with us in the beginning who played a little bit of theorbo, but wasn't really conversant in performance practice or in continuo. And so for the second lineup, we worked with a different guitarist who was Colombian, who had studied all sorts of Mexican traditional music and plays a lot of, he plays theorbo and plays lute and plays modern guitar as well as Spanish guitar. 3 out of the 4 of us are conversant in Spanish, and my Spanish is really bad. So I was the artistic director of the Spanish group. And here I was, the white Jewish outsider who doesn't speak Spanish but is married to somebody who's half Spanish. So what language should we speak, should we practice rehearsals, and all of these nuanced issues came up regarding language, ownership, where are we coming from? It was very subtle, but really interesting. You know, even just basic things like how do you count, and what's a hemiola, for a dancer who can embody that, but had never heard of the term, but certainly knew hemiolas and was dancing them all of her life. And then we also brought in Mexican dance, traditional dance, that I was playing harpsichord to. So there was a lot of, it felt both mainstream and new and innovative at the same time, and working through this process very gently and trying to be democratic. And I said, do you think we could learn something from this experience? Can we write an article? So I sent out 6 pages of questions and I sent them out to everybody in the group, and it literally took about 6 months till I got the answers back, and now I'm just reading through that, wanting to write an article. But I thought that the process of engaging in these differences was so important in terms of stylistic ownership, and where do you feel comfortable, and in chamber music, do you feel represented? I mean, I know that I certainly have culturally appropriated many people's traditions as a musician, and I also feel defensive, you know, if I see somebody who's not Jewish playing klezmer. So I think all of us want to feel safe, and we want to feel represented, and we want to be able to talk and not hurt each other's feelings. And I think that it's something that is going to take a really long time, and we will inevitably hurt people unintentionally, and we need to tread carefully and be open to receiving the feedback and Yeah, that's all I wanted to share.
Wow. Well, I'll just comment first. I think it's a beautiful idea. And it sounds like you're onto a beautiful way of discovering this music. We have in Seattle something called the Seattle Fandango Project, and it might be worth backing up a step to understand what Fandango means in Mexico. And Monica, is this a tradition you're familiar with, or have you have you worked with the Seattle Fandango Project?
Yes, I have. We've collaborated. And, I see a member of the Seattle Fandango Project here in the audience too, and she can also can respond. I don't know, Carrie, if you would like to add to this. I would be more comfortable if you can share about the Fandango tradition, because it's really important also to identify, because some things that you mentioned sound like this person may be practicing a more folkloric kind of version of the Fandango, and it's really important to also do deeper research. But I'll let Carrie elaborate a little bit more about this. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Monica. Hi, I'm Carrie Lanza, and I have been a member of Seattle Fandango Project for about 10 years. I myself am of Southern Italian and Irish heritage. I'm actually an Irish citizen. So practicing, again, as a white person with European roots, the praxis, we do a lot of work around identity in the group, within the group, and especially when we're front-facing the community, when we're interfacing with folks. So that said, the history of Fandango is very much an Afro-Indigenous Spanish tradition. It really is about that encounter between these different cultures, and also to be mindful of the Arab roots of a lot of the string instruments. And there are many names for the tradition that get used in Veracruz, in southern Veracruz, which is where that son jarocho specifically comes from. But there are Fandango traditions all the way across Mexico and across Spain. So what I would recommend, actually, as a starting point, is there was a conference on Fandango looking at it across different contexts, and a sort of an academic encounter between practitioners and scholars of Mexican Fandango traditions and Spanish Fandango traditions, because it means a lot of different things. There are lots of different Fandango musical tradition, like musical structures, as well as the party that the Fandango, which is the word has West African roots, right, actually has. And that, if you go onto academia.edu and you put in the word Fandango, you'll find the entire contents. You can download all of the papers that were given at that conference. I think it was 2015. And they're fascinating. And some of them are in English, some of them are in Spanish, but there's several of our close circle of colleagues and wonderful musician scholars like Iris Viveros and Marta Gonzalez were both there. So I would recommend starting there and then looking at the work and there are also other scholars. I'd be happy to touch base with you, but really remembering that is rooted in the community. It's participatory, it's something you play in community. And then there's also the folklorico, the state created folklorization of it, because it became the state dance of Veracruz, right? So, and they call that a fandango blanco, right? Literally, because you wear the white dress and the white with the red, there's an outfit, where that's not what happens in the campo, right? So like in the community, it would look different. It's also a tradition that is practiced through it. As of the 1990s, became part of the Chicano movement in the United States. So that generation of the Chicano movement started to practice son jarocho as a means of resistance and resilience in the United States, and it's since spread around the world. You can find Fandango communities who are playing son jarocho with the purpose of community building and resistance and resilience across Europe too. So this music has a life of its own, and we continue to write all the time. So we're both singing, versos that were written 400 years ago, and we're writing them right now. Sorry if that was too much.
Wow,
Thank
that's
you.
beautiful.
That was really terrific. Thank you. It's really a joy to have you on the call. I'm going to just switch to another project that's that Sally Niamawat would like to present from her ensemble Infusion Baroque in Canada. I don't know if are you in Montreal, Sally Nia? I'm not quite sure. I'll unmute you. But they're developing a project entitled East Meets West, which includes repertoire representing cross-cultural connections between the West and the Orient. Pieces included by Telemann, Rameau, Bird, some transcriptions of Siamese melodies by Gervais and Lalande. We wish to further develop this project by reimagining or reinterpreting these works from a culturally authentic perspective rather than a culturally appropriated one. Our first performance was in collaboration with the Thai-Canadian Cultural Organization, a native Thai singer, but we are looking further at this project by partnering with other artists with expertise in Turkish, Persian, and Indian transitional music. Salini, I'll just unmute you. So if you want to say anything more, or if you want just to have Gus respond.
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been so inspiring, and I think an important discussion to have during these times. So yes, so this project has been sort of a recent project for us. We presented the first concert this past season, and the intention of it was it was part of a series that is based on sort of this concept of cross-cultural relationships. So this one in particular focused on the Orient. And as with all of our programs, we do sort of a brief pre-concert lecture for the audience to introduce some to the music, and also to provide the cultural context and the socioeconomic context of the music. So as we were doing the research into this project, first of all, I have to say that we were very fortunate to be able to partner with a organization in Ottawa that specializes in Thai culture, and it has a very personal connection for me because my cultural roots are from Thailand, and Siam is the former name of what's currently known as Thailand. So we were able to really explore this part of our program in a way that made me feel comfortable doing it. However, as we were doing the research into the other pieces, so of course these are works by Telemann, Fuchs, Rameau, that take sort of what their interpretation of Oriental melodies and then put them into this sort of Western context. My lecture before the concert became all about colonialism, and I had to sort of present it in such a way that gave recognition to this practice of cultural appropriation, but at the same time celebrate the music. And I kind of in retrospect, because there's been interest for us to further develop this project, and we as an ensemble are very interested in doing that, I find myself at sort of an ethical crossroads, because while this music, of course, is wonderful, it comes from this place of repression and cultural appropriation. So, I mean, at the moment, our ideal way of going forward would be to almost, I hesitate to say rewrite the music, but in a sense, it would be, taking these melodies and adding some kind of authenticity to them by, using or consulting and perhaps collaborating with experts. But, obviously this turns into a very large and expensive project that is also not very realistic to tour with if you have so many collaborators or instruments, things like that. So I guess, yeah, this is sort of where I'm at. I don't have any specific questions at the moment other than what people's thoughts would be in terms of, coming to this this sort of ethical conundrum, I guess, in interpreting some of these works.
I think we do face that every time we perform a piece of music and leave it to be unexplained, what the context of the music is. And it just sounds like a beautiful idea. And also because of your cultural heritage, it's an idea that you own. So I find that very inspiring, actually, and how you develop it. My personal impression is, coming from your voice, you can take it in many directions, and you impart authenticity to the conversation, even if it's a hard, difficult, confusing conversation. So sounds beautiful.
And I want to add that you're doing all the right things too. It sounds like being uncomfortable, you're asking the questions that you need to be asking, and you're not limiting yourself right there. You say you're in an ethical crossroads. So this doesn't end. I'm always questioning also what do I do? How do I present what I want to present? It's not said and done. It's a process, and always checking in with yourself, with others in the community, as you plan and continue exploring, what the ethical questions are. So I feel like you're in the right path, and I agree, yes, that this sounds like a beautiful project. So congratulations.
Thank you.
I think the one thing that can be said from all of these experiences is that we must feel uncomfortable. We can't go into this ever thinking that we are going to take the easy way out, because there is no easy way. It's going to make everybody feel uncomfortable at a certain point. And I think it's certainly on us white people to help the communities of color that we're trying to work with feel less uncomfortable. It is our job to do that. We're approaching the end of our session, which is incredibly sad, because there's so much we could bring up here, and we are going to save every comment in the chat, and we can return to those in a follow-up discussion, which I think is very important to schedule. But I do want to bring in a question from Jennifer Meller. It seems that more than bringing in artists of color or creating collaborations with artists of color, what could be more impactful is to strive toward opening up our systems to make people of color feel more welcome in the early music/dance world. The collaborations tend to seem a bit forced in many cases. It doesn't mean I don't want to continue to strive to collaborate, but I want to look for unique and new ways of collaboration that are deeper than juxtaposition. I'm so happy to hear this conversation. I've heard Monica speak before, and I'm grateful for the deep and clear articulation of the issues, as well as the patience and kindness, absolutely, in the face of our ignorance. I think that fear of tokenism or forcing something together or creating a juxtaposition often stops us from even embarking on a project, because we don't want to be seen as saviors. We don't want to be seen as presenting a token. We want to do something, because I think most of us on this conversation, all of us are coming at it really from a very deep-seated belief in wanting to do the right thing. But there's just so much fear.
Monica, I would turn that to you.
To elaborate on this. Yeah, well, I think I missed a specific question, because there was so much in this. What was the specific question?
The specific question is, what could we strive at? Can we open up our systems to make people of color feel more welcome? So what can we do with what we are doing without changing or just bolting something onto a program? What can we do in a more, I guess, to bring people in? And this actually came up with another question. If we want to really genuinely collaborate in a way moving forward, rather than creating a one-off project, perhaps, what can we be doing to open up everything we do? Or should we not be even asking that question? Is that something that's not appropriate? That's a good question in itself.
I guess the reason why I thought Gus could answer these questions, because I'm not sure what early music can do, how to bring more audiences to that setting, to those white spaces, to early music, classical music. Conversations that Gus and I have been having recently is how to use your resources, your privilege to open those spaces for people of color to practice their traditions, to perform, right? Gus and I are collaborating for a performance that I will be putting on next year, for example, which is a production called the Ingi Mandinga, which I produced some years ago. I'm going to restage this performance next year, and it's a bilingual English-Spanish multidisciplinary and intergenerational performance that celebrates the multi-ethnic diversity in Latin America, but centering the voices and perspective of African descent Latinos. And the reason why I'm able to do this is because Gus has offered support. Gus said, how can early music Seattle how can we make ourselves available to you? How can we be of use to you so that you can bring these voices and center these voices, right? So this is an opportunity to bring representatives of these minorities together to preserve and cultivate their valuable heritage. And while Early Music Seattle has already committed overhead support and marketing and doing all the finances and everything, so instead of them pushing to bring people of color to early music settings or performances, they are trying to make their resources available for people of color to practice their traditions. So that's one way that we're in the planning process of this. So we'll see how it goes. But I think it's something that has been key for Gus and me to be able to be here today and have this conversation is because we feel this relationship too. Somebody mentioned earlier about the process and the relationship building. That's really important, and being open to listen. And I don't know, Gus, if you want to add more. These answers that.
Yeah, just to make a comment further, going back to the introduction of this workshop, is the idea to tell a big story of ancient music traditions and how we're all related. If it is, then the project that Monica describes right now does that. What overlays our way of doing business right now is the institutional relationship, the institutional racism of the United States that we unwittingly fall into lockstep. So when we talk about bringing people into early music, we're mostly talking about our comfort zones and how we see racial relationships. If we're talking about music, ancient music traditions that we are supposed to uplift, then however we do that, with the resources available, with the partnerships, with the privilege that we can bring to the conversation, that's our responsibility.
And I think we tend to forget that because we tend to have expensive degrees that have given us a sense of superiority or ownership, perhaps, of a lot of the work. We feel like we've earned this organization, and therefore we can make the decisions. And I think we have to turn that on its head to some extent. And I want to, Elizabeth Roberts has made a few comments, and Elizabeth, I believe, runs Orchestra Northwest. Is that correct, Elizabeth? I mean, she just made a comment, doesn't making people of color feel more welcome or comfortable require building/creating a sense of belonging first? But I wanted to just ask, do you mean creating a sense of belonging with the community? I mean, you're suggesting that create a sense of belonging of the people, the other communities? I just wanted to clarify what you meant by that, Elizabeth. Are you there? I'm just trying to unmute.
I also have something to say.
Because I think a lot of I'm not able to unmute Elizabeth, so I don't know if you want to.
I can unmute myself.
Oh, that's
Are we all set?
Yep.
Monica, did you want to say something first?
Thank you. No, I wanted to say that that sense of belonging is really important. When I met Gus and he was talking about early music, what I had in mind was like classical Chinese, Indian music and Japanese or Korean, court music or Ottoman Empire, like that to me is early music. So I didn't have a connection. So that is key. So when you say why people of color are not coming to early music, there is no connection, right? So that
Right.
Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yes, that's exactly right. You say it in a slightly different way, but yes. What if you want people to bring people together into this fold that appreciates early music and attends events and celebrations and concerts and so on, they must feel like they belong. They must feel like they belong in this space and the space where the event's taking place, and welcomed by the feeling of culture, and it's just deeper than just saying we want you to be comfortable. It's to me, it's deeper than that. It's a sense of belonging, and that, in my view, comes from trust. And that trust takes time to build. And Gus knows well, because we work with Paula Nava Madrigal, who is our artistic director and conductor. And that is what she does with much of her time, is reach out to the Latino community members in Seattle and invite them to feel that this is their music, this is their event.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's really, that I think that actually great words to close this session on, I think. Though I'd like to just hand it back to Gus and Monica to actually close this out for us.
Monica, maybe we can just make some of our closing comments about, there were just, I think, three things that we wanted to mention. We've sort of discussed the participation of people of color in early music ensembles and organizations, but we didn't come exactly to address that connection today. So I do think that is another topic. It comes, I think it comes from board and staff leadership. We need people of color in leadership roles in early music. We need them to represent not necessarily white culture, but we need people to represent the communities that are the ones that Monica is talking about here as well. So that is a tall order for us, and something that I think we need to work to do. And I'll also just mention again, nothing will happen without money. And so funding sources to make things happen differently than they've always happened are important. And those funding sources need to have a ring drawn around them for these purposes. It seems like a wonderful time to establish funds like this, so that artists, like everyone on this call, wants to try this. They need the resources to try. And Monica, anything closing?
You covered everything, Gus. There's a whole other conversation to this over funding sources and what this money, where this money goes to, definitely. But just as a conclusion, remember the history that's been told today, about appropriation, cultural appropriation. So don't appropriate other people's stories. Remember what the dynamics are between the colonizer and those people who are striving to advance socially in so many ways, right? People of color. Stay in constant communication, build meaningful relationships, challenge yourselves to try new things, to listen, to maybe people of color have a different way of doing things that are gonna be good for you to learn. I mean, engage in conversation and build relationships, and do your research as well. Thank you so much for this meeting. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much. And thank you to everybody else for spending so much of your time with us today. Really is a privilege and an honor to have you. And we will, without question, be following up with more calls like this, because this is clearly the way we are moving forward. And I think we should all be extremely happy about that. That gives us really something to work toward. So thank you.
Thank you,
We'll
Karen.
be in touch very soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.